This is the moment the global economy was held at gunpoint, and the man pulling the trigger was not even Iranian. 20% of the world's oil supply, 17 million barrels a day. Every single tanker, every cargo ship, every energy shipment that passes through the narrowest and most strategically critical waterway on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz, stopped. Not delayed. Not threatened. Stopped. Iran did not whisper this warning. It broadcast it. Senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy stood before cameras and declared, with no diplomatic language to soften it, that the Strait of Hormuz was closed, and that it would not reopen under any condition linked to foreign military pressure, that every vessel attempting to transit without Iranian authorization was entering a combat zone, that the mines were already in the water. And then Vladimir Putin picked up the phone and became Iran's translator to the world, not Russia's foreign minister. Not a Kremlin spokesperson. Putin personally, calling European leaders, calling the heads of state of India, Turkey, and China, relaying Tehran's terms, speaking for a government that the West had spent years trying to isolate, with the full weight of the Russian presidency behind every word. In this breakdown, we go through what the Hormuz closure actually costs the world per day, why Putin inserted himself as Iran's voice, which countries are already cracking under the economic pressure, and the one move that nobody in Washington has a clean answer for. This is not a story about a waterway. This is a story about two sanctioned, cornered, furious governments that just decided to move together, and aimed at the one pressure point that the entire global economy cannot survive losing. For 40 years, Iran had used the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate leverage card. Every time Western pressure escalated, sanctions, military buildups, diplomatic ultimatums, Tehran would gesture toward Hormuz and watch oil markets spike. It was a threat so powerful precisely because it was never fully used. A weapon holstered is more useful than a weapon fired, because once you fire it, the other side is forced to respond. The plan Iran had always relied upon was controlled escalation. Push to the edge, extract concessions, pull back. It had worked in 2011. It had worked in 2019. Western governments had always calculated that Iran would not actually close Hormuz because the economic damage to Iran itself would be catastrophic. Iran's own oil exports flow through the same strait. But that calculation was built on one assumption, that Iran was alone. Iran is no longer alone. And that changes every equation. Russia, cut off from Western financial systems, excluded from global payment networks, locked out of European energy markets after the Ukraine war, had spent 3 years building an alternative economic architecture with China, India, and Iran at its center. Oil traded in non-dollar currencies, shipping routes that bypass Western-controlled choke points, financial systems that do not touch SWIFT. The infrastructure of a parallel global economy built specifically to function without Western permission. When Iran closed Hormuz, it did not close it as a desperate, isolated nation making a reckless gamble. It closed it as a partner inside a bloc that had already pre-positioned itself to absorb the consequences, and to make sure the West absorbed more. He gambled that Iran's economic pain would always be greater than its political will. He assumed Tehran would never burn the one card that cost itself as much as it cost everyone else. He assumed wrong. Because Iran found someone willing to share the cost. At 6:14 a.m. local time, IRGC Navy speedboats moved in coordinated formations across the Hormuz Strait. 3 commercial tankers, one Greek-owned, one Japanese-chartered, one carrying cargo bound for South Korea, were approached and ordered to hold position or face weapons fire. All 3 stopped. Within 40 minutes, Lloyd's of London had suspended war risk insurance coverage for all vessels in the Persian Gulf. Without that insurance, no commercial shipping company on Earth will move a tanker. The closure did not need mines across the entire strait. It only needed the credible threat of force and the disappearance of insurance. Both happened before 7 a.m. Brent crude jumped $11 in the first hour of trading, then $17. By midday, the spike had reached $24 per barrel above the prior close, the single largest single-day oil price movement since the 2008 financial crisis. Gasoline futures in the United States hit levels not seen in 3 years. European natural gas markets, still fragile after years of post-Ukraine energy restructuring, spiked simultaneously. While oil markets were convulsing, something else was also happening at that exact same moment in Moscow. Vladimir Putin had not issued a statement condemning the closure. He had not called for de-escalation. He had placed calls to the leaders of India, Turkey, Germany, and France personally and delivered a message. Iran's terms for reopening Hormuz were specific and non-negotiable, and Russia was the party authorized to convey them. Pause. Russia, authorized by Iran, to speak on Iran's behalf to European heads of state about the conditions under which the world's most critical energy choke point would reopen. That is not a diplomatic courtesy. That is a declaration of alliance so direct, so public, and so deliberately confrontational that it leaves no room for misreading. Putin is not mediating. Putin is representing. The Kremlin is Tehran's embassy to the Western world, and it just opened for business at the worst possible moment. And while European leaders were absorbing that call, something else was also happening simultaneously in Beijing. China, which imports approximately 80% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, had gone conspicuously quiet. No condemnation of Iran, no call for the strait to reopen, no pressure on Tehran through the diplomatic backchannels that Beijing had spent years building. China's silence was not confusion, it was calculation. What the cameras are not covering is the conversation that happened between Moscow and Tehran in the 72 hours before the closure was announced. According to regional intelligence sources familiar with the exchange, Putin's government provided Iran with 3 specific assurances before Tehran made its move. First, Russia would not join any Western-led diplomatic initiative demanding the strait reopen. Second, Russian state media would frame the closure globally as a legitimate act of national defense against military aggression, not as economic terrorism. Third, Russia's back-channel relationships with India and Turkey would be used to prevent those countries from publicly endorsing Western pressure on Iran, keeping the global coalition against Tehran fractured and incomplete. In return, Iran agreed to route a specific volume of its oil exports through Russian-brokered channels, bypassing dollar-denominated markets entirely at prices that benefit Moscow's parallel energy economy. This is not a friendship. This is a transaction. 2 governments that distrust each other, that have competed for regional influence for decades, that have profoundly different long-term visions for the Middle East, locked together by the one thing they share, a common enemy in Western economic power, and a common interest in demonstrating that it can be challenged without fatal consequences. One senior European diplomat, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the situation in terms that were blunt enough to be alarming. We built 30 years of sanctions architecture on the assumption that isolation breaks governments. We are now watching 2 isolated governments use their isolation as a weapon. Follow the economics and the answer becomes clear. Every day the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, the global economy loses an estimated $1.2 billion in disrupted energy trade. Not in a month, per day. The countries that feel that pain fastest are not the United States, which has expanded domestic energy production significantly. The countries that feel it first are in Asia and Europe. Japan, South Korea, India, Germany, Italy, economies that run on Gulf energy and have no short-term alternative. That is the strategic logic of the closure. It is not designed to hurt America first. It is designed to fracture the coalition of countries that America needs to sustain pressure on Iran. When Japan's economy is bleeding, Tokyo does not call Washington to coordinate a harder line. Tokyo calls Tehran to ask what it would take to reopen the strait. Russia's role as Iran's voice accelerates that fracture, because every European government that takes Putin's call is implicitly acknowledging that Russia has a legitimate seat at this table, which rebuilds the Kremlin's diplomatic relevance that 2 years of Ukraine-related isolation had eroded. This is the power shift hidden inside the crisis. Iran gets its nuclear leverage restored through economic pain. Russia gets its diplomatic rehabilitation through being the only party with a direct line to Tehran. And the Western alliance, already strained by trade disputes, political divisions, and Ukraine fatigue, faces a stress test it was not designed to pass at this speed. The legal position is equally complex. Closing an international strait is a violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the enforcement mechanism for that violation is military force. And military force against Iran, with Russia publicly positioned as Tehran's diplomatic partner, carries escalation risks that no Western government has publicly modeled in full. If Hormuz stays closed beyond 2 weeks, the economic consequences stop being a market event and become a political crisis in every country that imports Gulf energy. Governments fall over energy prices. They always have. If Western naval forces attempt to reopen the strait by force, Iran has pre-positioned anti-ship missile batteries, drone swarms, and IRGC speedboat tactics specifically designed to make that operation costly enough to deter it. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is in the region. But a military confrontation in the world's most oil-dense waterway, with global energy markets already in shock, is a risk that Wall Street, European capitals, and Asian manufacturing economies are all screaming at Washington to avoid. Putin is watching all of this with visible satisfaction. Because every day that Western governments negotiate with him as Iran's representative, the narrative of Russian isolation collapses. He is not isolated. He is indispensable. And he engineered that position by simply being the one party willing to take Tehran's call when everyone else was trying to make Tehran irrelevant. The countries quietly breaking from Western consensus are already visible. Turkey has refused to join any condemnation statement. India has opened direct government-to-government talks with Tehran about alternative transit routes. Hungary has called for immediate negotiation rather than confrontation. The coalition is already cracking, and the strait has only been closed for days. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is the proof of concept for a new kind of global power, one built not on military dominance or economic size, but on the willingness to impose unbearable costs on a system that everybody depends on and nobody has built a genuine alternative to. Iran and Russia did not beat the West in a fair competition. They found the one pressure point where the West's strength, its globally connected, energy-dependent, insurance-driven, dollar-settled trading system becomes its vulnerability. And they pressed it together at the same time. You cannot sanction a country into submission if that country finds a partner willing to absorb the cost. You cannot isolate a government that another nuclear power is willing to speak for. You cannot enforce international law through a waterway when enforcing it risks a war that costs more than the alternative. Watch the next 10 days. If a single major Asian economy breaks from Western consensus and opens direct bilateral talks with Tehran, bypassing Washington, the closure achieves its political objective even if the strait eventually reopens. The fracture will have been created. And fractures do not heal on diplomatic timelines. Watch Putin's next move. If he escalates his role from conveyor of terms to active mediator proposing a framework, one that gives Iran partial relief from military pressure in exchange for partial reopening, he has transformed Russia from a sanctioned aggressor into the indispensable broker of the most important crisis on Earth. Three things are already irreversible. 1. Iran has demonstrated it will use Hormuz as a weapon, not just a threat. That changes every future negotiation permanently. 2. Russia has publicly installed itself as a diplomatic representative of a state in direct confrontation with the West. That relationship will not be undone regardless of how this crisis resolves. 3. The global energy system's dependence on a single 21-mile-wide strait has been exposed as the civilizational vulnerability it has always been. And the world now knows that 2 nuclear-armed governments are willing to exploit it. Subscribe. This story moves fast, and the next development, whether a military response, a coalition fracture, or a Putin-brokered deal, will redefine the outcome entirely. I will break it down the moment it moves. The strait may reopen. The world it reopens into will not be the one that existed before it closed.